Good evening, I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and I want to welcome you to a very important event this evening. This is the first forum presented by the Kennedy School's new Human Rights Initiative, which is a brand new program that's devoting itself to research and analysis on human rights policies. The program is a program of our Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and its faculty chair is Graham Allison, director of that center. And the program itself is directed by Samantha Power, who is a native of Ireland, a graduate of Yale, and is reported from Bosnia, which seem to be good credentials for this. We're delighted to have her with us. And we're also grateful to a Kennedy School graduate, Greg Carr, for his support of this program. There's no more appropriate way for the Human Rights Initiative to introduce itself to the Kennedy School and to Harvard and to the local community than to pose the difficult and crucially important question of what the West and other countries could or should have done to prevent or halt the Rwanda genocide. I was sent in 1995, when I was working in the Department of Defense, to Rwanda, a year after the genocide. My mission was to see what could be done to make sure something like this would never happen again. I'll never forget being taken in a helicopter over the beautiful green fields of Rwanda, the rolling hills, a truly pastoral setting, and landing alongside a churchyard. And when we went into the churchyard, there's a platform with some 400 skulls on it, some of them skulls of children, women with kerchiefs still on them. And inside the church were clothing, pieces of human remains, suitcases, and a picture of the Pope. Some would say this is a clash of civilizations. No, I don't think so. In fact, the people who were involved in this were very similar to each other, as I'm sure the panel will talk about tonight. It perhaps should be seen more in terms of a term that Freud once used, the narcissism of small differences. How people can treat other people the way they did in the genocide in Rwanda is an enduring puzzle. Our part of it is to ask the question of what can be done, what can outsiders do, what could have been done to prevent that in policy terms from happening again. As I said, my mission when I was sent to Rwanda was to talk with African governments and offer them a deal that the United States Defense Department would offer to provide transportation and logistics at which we were capable if they would provide troops for rapid insertion to prevent another genocide. There were very few African governments that were willing to take this up. In other words, the problem of inadequate response was not just of the West, it was a problem of the neighbors as well. And that leaves open the question that I raised. Not only what could have been done in 1994, but what can be done now and in the future. Raising this sort of issue here at the Kennedy School under the new Human Rights Initiative seems to be something that will be central to our mission. And in that sense, I think tonight's panel is particularly important, not only because of the distinction of the people on it, but because of the importance of the subject which is addressing. We're also fortunate to have Rwanda's ambassador, Ambassador Rusingwa, who has flown up from Washington to be with us this evening. And we're fortunate to have as moderator for this panel, Cornel West, one of Harvard's most distinguished faculty members, the Alphonse Fletcher University professor, professor of Afro-American Studies, and professor of the philosophy of religion, author of numerous works, including The Future of American Progressivism. And let me turn the proceedings over to Professor West. Cornel.
Thank you very much, Dean Joseph Nye. No, thank you very much, Dean Joseph Nye. It's a very crucial, important, in many ways historic gathering here at Harvard. We know that Harvard at its best has always been involved in the quest for truth, veritas. And certainly one condition, the possibility of truth, is to allow suffering to speak. And we will be speaking about suffering and wrestling with evil, unjustified suffering and unnecessary social misery. And I am quite Delighted that you all saw fit to invite me to be a part of this discussion. I want to move right into the introduction of our distinguished panelists. Beginning first, of course, the author of the text that brings us together, from the New Yorker, Philip Gravich. Some of you may have heard him this morning with Chris Light, and it was quite fascinating. Chris, I think, is one of the best in the country. And to have you there as part of that discussion so that those around the area could also hear was so very important. Since 1995, Philip has been writing about Africa for the New Yorker, where he is a staff writer. The title of his book, We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Family, Stories from Rwanda, was just recently published. He used to be arts editor and contributing editor of The Forward in New York. And of course, many of you read his pieces in the New Yorker. He will speak first for about 8 to 10 minutes or so. We'll then move to Alison DeForge, who worked for Human Rights Watch as a consultant to the African Division, long-term Rwandan expert. And she just informed me that she's finished a 750-page text on genocide in Rwanda. We'll then move to Sarah Sewell, who was a Rhodes Scholar and former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Peacekeeping. She was in this post at the Pentagon in April of 1994, and she's currently the Associate Director of the Committee on International Security Studies at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Fourth, we will hear from Payan Akavan, who is the visiting lecturer at law at the Yale Law School. He's now presently taking a little time off from the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, as well as the Tribunal for Rwanda. He has worked with both since 1994. Last but by no means least, our colleague down the road, Professor Barry Posens, Professor of Political Science at MIT. His areas of specialization include comparative grand strategy and military doctrine. He's the author of The Sources of Military Doctrine and Inadvertent Escalation, and the winner of many book awards, including the APSA 1985 Woodrow Wilson Book Award. Let our discussion begin. Philip. Let's give them all a hand, though, initially.
What happened in Rwanda in 1994 was probably what I speak of as the single most unambiguous case of full-fledged state-sponsored genocide, an attempt to systematically eliminate an entire category of humanity since the extermination of European Jewry in World War II in Europe, and certainly since the drafting of the Genocide Convention, which was drafted immediately after World War II, in the kind of heady days of triumph over Nazism amongst the world powers, when the notion was afoot that we must never let this sort of thing happen again on our planet. Utopian visions of world order may seem a strange response to genocide, but they also, it was a genuine and passionate sense of revulsion, a sense of having seen something that humanity is capable of that perhaps we hadn't glimpsed in modernity so fully before, and that there was the feeling that one really had to kind of take a concerted sense of global community, of humanity standing in some sense as humanity, to prevent and take action against this. That was what the Genocide Convention was about, and in many ways, I think, in a discussion of what might one have done in 1994 in Rwanda, the Genocide document, the Genocide Convention becomes kind of the framing document of this discussion in some ways, and finally its evisceration becomes the story. What happened in Rwanda, in very brief terms, in the course of approximately 100 days, nobody knows exactly how many. The best estimates seem to be at least 800,000 people of the Tutsi minority and Hutus who opposed, members of the Hutu majority who opposed the slaughter by other members of the Hutu majority of the Tutsis were killed. If that seems confusing, it really isn't that confusing. There was a systematic attempt by the government to eliminate the Tutsi population, and those who were viewed as political opponents from within the Hutu majority were also quite frequently, though not as systematically in all cases, targeted for death. It was treated by the world as a surprise. It was not a surprise. It was something that was reasonably well known to be, in one form or another, in gestation as a possibility, certainly, a program of massacres, perhaps not of this scope, but certainly of this character, was known to be in gestation in Rwanda for some period building up to it. Probably the most interesting thing is that, the genesis of the genocidal logic, as Rwandans oddly enough speak of it, because genocide, though what happened in Rwanda is often seen as chaos or anarchy, that level of destruction requires tremendous organization, and indeed had it. I think that it's often recognized that because Rwanda was involved since 1990 in a civil war, on again, off again, but essentially a war situation, the genocide was, in a sense, a product of that war. But in many ways, it was really a response to a peace. In August of 1993, a peace deal was made. The entrenched interests surrounding the then president, Habyarimana, of what is now known as the Hutu power clique, the extremist fanatics who masterminded the organization of the genocide. I simplify here for the purposes of time and convenience. Essentially, faced by the threat, as they saw it, of power sharing with Tutsis, with political opponents of various stripes, began then to mobilize what can really be thought of as the final mobilization towards what they themselves at times seem to have referred to as the final solution. It was during that period also that a UN peacekeeping force was deployed as part of the peace deal to Rwanda. And one of the sort of most fascinating documents was how in January of 1994, an informant from within the government of President Habyarimana went to the commander, then commander, Major General Romeo Dallaire of the UNAMIR, the UN peacekeeping force, a Canadian. He went to him and he informed him of his job, which was training militias. And he explained essentially what, in about 10 points, he laid out what turns out to have been a rather remarkably tight blueprint for the genocide that began finally in April of 1994. He said that he has been ordered to register all Tutsis and Kigalis. He suspects it is for their extermination. Example he gave is that in 20 minutes his personnel could kill up to 1,000 Tutsis. This is a fax that was sent into peacekeeping headquarters at the United Nations in New York, announcing what the sender of the fax, the general in charge of the mission, thought of as very credible source, speaking of an extermination. This is not the sort of language that generally comes through the telegram traffic at the UN. It didn't get very far. The head of peacekeeping at the time was now Secretary General Kofi Annan. It was treated essentially as a routine bureaucratic matter. His deputy then, Iqbal Riza, explained to me that he wrote the answer, that he regarded it as part of an ongoing communication and saw no reason to draw special attention to it, that it's abnormal anyway to draw special attention to such things, and so forth. The shame of that response, I think, is pretty self-evident. So the exact level of how much of that fax it was known to the rest of the world, one may argue about. But the information was clearly out there in many, many levels. I think Alison DeForge will be able to depress us in much greater detail about how deeply that information was known by the world's governments. When the killing began, as I say, it was treated quite widely as a surprise. The United States government, which often likes to speak of something called the international community, which is usually something it is. We now talk a lot, for instance, about how the international community insists, which means Richard Holbrooke insists, and it's kind of an interesting euphemism, but different people mean different things by this. At the time, the United States was we're the sole remaining superpower. We were on the Security Council. The American official position at the time was that we should get out in a hurry. The Rwandans had studied in great detail the history of international intervention forces, essentially to the effect that quite often, if you attacked them, they ran away. Somalia was a recent memory. In the Hutu power propaganda preceding the genocide, in their own internal newspapers and conversations and radio discourse, there was a clear discussion, you know, when the going gets tough, these guys will run away. On the first morning of the massacres, 10 Belgian blue helmets were taken prisoner, murdered, mutilated, and within a very short order, it was decided instantaneously, really, that the force should be reduced. Well, the United States would have had it to nothing. 250 people were left there in an ineffectual form. General Dallaire said with 5,000 men in the free hand, he could have stopped this. This argument then leads really to a kind of broader sense of what was going on. The American administration took the position that we shouldn't call it a genocide, because a genocide, according to the Genocide Convention, required action. There's a fascinating, I'll be brief, but a very brief exchange took place at a news conference during the period in mid-June when genocide was a taboo word in the administration. Somebody asked a State Department spokesman, well, look, you're saying genocide happens when certain acts happen, and you say those acts have happened in Rwanda, so why can't you say genocide has happened? The answer was, because, Alan, there is a reason for the selection of the words that we have made, and perhaps I have, I'm not a lawyer, I don't approach this from the international legal and scholarly point of view. We try, best as we can, to accurately reflect a description and particularly addressing that issue. The issue is out there, people have obviously been looking at it. And I calculate that, speaking a little more slowly, that would have taken somewhere between 1 minute and 2 minutes, which means somewhere between 5.5 and 11 Tutsis on average would have been killed in Rwanda while it took her to say that. Eventually, the American administration was shamed, and it allowed the word genocide to be used. On the new interpretation of the Genocide Convention, it does not require action. It permits it. This is rubbish. It's clear that it requires it, but what happened was a permanent, or a really crucial precedent was created in which the identification of the crime of genocide and the obligation under international convention to act was snipped. And I think that that's really, in some deepest way, what we have to look at when we ask, what might we have done? The debate is, could we have done anything? Clearly we could have. Did we want to? Clearly we did not want to, because we did not do it. And I think that in Rwanda, when one looks, as any of us who spent any time there have, at what made people act in the ways that they did, one of the crucial things is some level of wanting to or not wanting to, especially those who resisted the killing in Rwanda at a time when many people succumbed to it, people they wouldn't have expected to. They would often say they didn't have to if they didn't want to. We didn't have to do nothing, we wanted to do nothing. Now, we have to decide if we want to do nothing. Because the worst thing, I believe, is there are people who will argue that it's not in our interest. That may be. In that case, the question is, why do we say that we may do something? And to me, really, the debate that needs to be had is, if we do not want to intervene in these events, would it not be wiser, more right, more correct, truer, to say, frankly, we're not coming? Because the false promise of protection extended by that UN force was calculated into the decisions of all of the players in Rwanda, and particularly of those who felt most in danger in making their decisions about what was coming. People foresaw terrible things, but they did not foresee the worst, so long as they felt that at least this represented the eye of the world and the concern of the world and some sense of the protection of the world. A safe haven has turned out to be one of the most unsafe places on earth if it's set up by the so-called international community. And I sometimes wonder, shouldn't the debate we're having be, if we don't want to act, let's not act. And let's say that we won't act. And I think the reason we're not having that debate is we can't stomach it. And I think that that's really where the debate comes down that's interesting, that I hope that in some ways we can have tonight, which is, why can't we stomach it? Is it possible that the price of non-intervention is something we're really not as willing to pay? Although we always talk about the price of intervention, maybe the price of not intervening is, in terms of humanity, in terms of morality, in terms of some sense of what it is to be safe in this world as a world community, all of these things. Perhaps there's some way in which we can't stomach being straight about that discussion. That's what I came away a lot thinking from Rwanda.
Thank you. I think we've been allowed to sit.
Sure.
What could have been done in Rwanda? To decide sensibly what could have worked, you have to have some sense of what was going on inside the country at the time. To talk about an international intervention in the abstract really has very little meaning. Let me try to give you a quick sketch of the internal dynamics and then put it together with what the international behavior caused and what it could have caused had the political will been there to act. Within the country, there was a large number of people who were passively committed to an ideology which was called Hutu power. These people were, at some level, convinced to be afraid of the Tutsi. Ridiculous as it seems to think about a majority people being afraid of a minority, that had been the result of a conscious propaganda campaign over a period of 4 years to convince the majority that the minority intended a genocide against them. Against logic, yes, but something that had its impact over time through very skillful building upon various events. The result was that when the head of government, the president of the country, was shot down, his airplane was shot down, there was created a temporary period of instability, which allowed a small group of people to take advantage of the situation and to attempt to mobilize that large reservoir of more or less passively committed people into a more active posture. They were able to do this by making use of the military. The small group, which was initially a few dozen, had access first to 3 key military units. From those military units, they were able to build out to a wider control of the military. This took place in a period of about 24 hours, and it involved the military initially rejecting this idea, and ultimately, after 24 hours, accepting it because it was given a civilian cover. Simultaneous with this was the first effort to enlist the help of the quote-unquote international community, which was rebuffed. And it was clear within a period of hours that the international actors knew well, not just because of the January 11th telegram that Philip has mentioned, but I have a 10-page list of indicators which had prepared people to know that ethnic violence, that killing of Tutsi as Tutsi was a projected plan and strategy. Knowing this, the major actors, led by the United States, within hours decided they wanted none of it and they were going to get out as fast as possible. This decision on the part of major international actors then cleared the way for that small, ambitious group to move ahead and to enlist the rest of the military machine. Having gotten the military machine moving towards further slaughter of Tutsi, the rest of the international community reacted by sending in some elite troops which had the sole task of taking the foreigners and leaving as quickly as possible. As they accomplished that mission, Belgium, which had the strongest part of the peacekeeping force, announced it was pulling its contingent out. That day, the initiators of the genocide were able to pull in the civilian administration. This was a highly organized political system, had been for centuries. People talked about the comparison to Somalia. It had no relevance whatsoever, except the fact that it was on the same continent. This was not a failed state, but a succeeding state that was doing too well what it intended to do. Having captured the civilian administration, the initiators of genocide went on to take in political opponents and to wipe out the distinctions among competing political parties to create a kind of pan-Hutu solidarity, where the only enemy was to be the Tutsi. Within 3 or 4 days of that, it became clear on the afternoon of April the 15th that the United Nations force would do nothing, and that the United States position was committed to a complete and total withdrawal of that force. Within 12 hours, the genocidal government had met and decided to extend the genocide into those parts of the country which up until then had successfully resisted and provided a haven of safety to the Tutsi. And over the next week, that is exactly what they did. Aside from that small group of totally committed people who were ready to kill and nothing would have stopped them except force, there was a vast reservoir of people who had to decide virtually day by day, how far will I go? What will I do? The incredible complexity of this phenomenon. This was not a simple people rise up and kill situation. This was a day-by-day decision. Will I kill a young man? All right, that's okay, I'll go that far. Will I kill a teenager? Will I kill an infant? Will I kill an old woman? People decided at different levels over a very long period of time what exactly they would do in this genocide. One important element in their decision was the legitimacy of the authorities that were either permitting or ordering them to kill. From where did this government get its legitimacy? It was a military government which had installed a civilian shield. And this civilian shield was accepted by the rest of the family of nations. By sheer coincidence, Rwanda had a seat at the table of the Security Council, which it retained through this entire period. On May the 15th, the government engaged in genocide sent a special delegation comprising the lead spokesman of the CDR, which was the most extreme anti-Tutsi party, and the foreign minister, who addressed the Security Council to defend their position. And in the august halls of the United Nations, the other 14 members of the Security Council sat and listened, as diplomatic protocol required. And of them, 8 made no significant comment at the end. Throughout this procedure, there was a continuing emphasis on using diplomacy to try to resolve the war which accompanied the genocide. And in the interest of attempting to get a ceasefire to end the war, diplomats and policymakers refused to take a firm moral position. They preferred to work by private telephone calls and private contacts. The result of this was that there was no condemnation to tell the Rwandan people that this is an illegitimate government. Now, you would think they wouldn't need to be told, right? But you have to recall that people make decisions on a variety of bases, and opportunism has a great deal to do with the decision-making process. Rwanda was a country which was very heavily dependent upon foreign assistance. People knew this at the local level because in every town, the local burgomaster was responsible for getting his own foreign aid money. So people knew how closely connected they were to foreign assistance. And if the international community had said, this government is no go, this government is genocidal, there will be no foreign aid for this government ever, how many people then would have chosen to fall into line and to follow the orders of this government? The whole question of legitimacy is of enormous importance in people's decision-making process, and the international community permitted the legitimacy of this government to go unquestioned. The French sent a message over time that the government was, in fact, actually very legitimate. Its representatives were received in Paris. A military mission that came to ask for aid brought back to Rwanda the message, France cannot help you now because there is too much discussion about this genocide. You must improve your public image. You must make yourselves acceptable to the international community. And this was translated over the radio, which was the voice of genocide, within the next 2 days by a message, no more cadavers on the road. Please, stop standing at the barriers and laughing while people are killed. This is not appropriate behavior. Out on the hills of Kibuye, the local village council, security council meeting debated throughout the month of May how killings needed to be hidden in order to win the recognition of the United States government. So there were messages being passed back and forth. And the message that we were sending was genocide is acceptable. Unfortunate, perhaps, something we wouldn't want to do ourselves, but it is acceptable. The possibility of military force, which we can talk about maybe in the question and answer period, if you want to talk about the troop statistics and how many there were on each side and who could have done what and gone where, that's very possible. It could have happened. It could have happened very effectively within 2 or 3 days. It could have cut it short. But if you had not wanted a troop intervention, there were other means available. There was a complete and total condemnation, embargo of these people, embargo of arms, the jamming of the radio of genocide, none of which would have required any form of military action and which would not have required an extraordinary amount of expense. And we did not do any of it.
Why not? I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer, and the explanation that I will offer is impartial and subjective and entirely unsatisfying and not offered in any way as a justification for inaction. But the reality is that as the genocide in Rwanda was beginning, the United States had its eye on a number of international crises that were chronic perhaps, but considered urgent. And most notably among them, we had just experienced an extraordinary humiliation in the context of the ongoing operation in Somalia in which 18 American servicemen were killed. And the Congress, not the public, I believe, but the congressional pressure was such that the administration did an abrupt turnabout, and the focus within the administration was very much on when can we bring our troops home. And at the same time, the administration was turning back from an initial peacekeeping effort in Haiti in the face of opposition. And of course, the administration was also extremely concerned about events in Yugoslavia. And all of these important issues were very much on the minds of people who looked at international affairs. And parenthetically, it's worth noting that the administration had just gone to the Congress and said, we've thought about peacekeeping, and we're only going to do peacekeeping if there's consent of the parties and if we can be completely impartial, and if there's a ceasefire. And if we're going to do something called peace enforcement, which is where you actually use force, then we promise that it will be very much in our nation's interest. And it was considered very difficult to make a case to the Congress that what we knew about the situation in Rwanda would meet that criteria. I think it's clear that not any intervention, but many forms of intervention would have made a significant difference. I think it's easy to overestimate how simple the task would have been. It clearly got harder as time went on, and as democracies in particular are wont to do, they like to take their time in decision-making. So the incremental spread of the violence, which became somewhat exponential, only complicated the task. And I won't go into details here, but I'd like to throw out a few questions that you would have faced had you been trying to plan an intervention in Rwanda, and I will use them to illustrate what I think we might be able to learn, some of the things we might be able to learn from our horrible failure to act. How would the forces differentiate between genocidal violence and violence that was being committed in the context of the ongoing civil war? If the population is homogeneous and the differentiation between Tutsi and Hutu occurs largely at checkpoints, is it appropriate for forces to prevent people from leaving their homes in the context of the spreading war? If safe havens are created, is it appropriate to separate out ethnic groups in creating separate safe havens for each? If the goal is to return to a negotiated political settlement, do the forces then become complicit in rewarding the people committing genocide? If the goal is to stop the killing regardless of who's committing it, and that happens to help one side a whole lot more than the other, does that matter? Does it matter if it helps the bad guys more? And in the context of trying to stop the genocide and trying to deal with those who are committing the genocide, will anybody be perturbed if due process is not respected? Those are just some of the questions that would come to mind in trying to plan an intervention. And I raise them because I think that there are some very difficult issues that the international community has to think about if we want to move toward what I would call a culture of automaticity, for lack of a better term, in terms of responding in future cases. They fall into three different categories, and I'll just touch on them very briefly. One being rethinking the doctrine, two being rethinking the identification and naming of genocide, and three being increasing one's capabilities for response. Simply put, the dichotomy between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, given the current state of affairs in which peace enforcement is a word that people are reluctant to utter, let alone implement, means that the level of force and proactive use of force that would be required to halt a genocide needs to be taken seriously, and basically peace enforcement needs to be brought back perhaps under a different name. And that requires a different way of thinking about using force and a different way of training people. At the same time, I think the larger dialogue among international organizations and non-governmental organizations and national governments about how messy the questions of intervening in genocide are, and how many rules will be broken, and how many mistakes will be made in the process of trying to serve a higher good, needs to be very frankly confronted. And those are very difficult questions, and questions that certain organizations that have been most critical of the failure to act in Rwanda, certain organizations will have a lot of soul searching to do in trying to work through some sort of understanding about what would and would not be supported in the context of such an intervention. In terms of the identification and naming, there's no question that there was a lot of information available. I don't know if a change in the type or presentation of the information would have made a difference. I think it's my own view that it would not have in the case of Rwanda because of the circumstances that I outlined at the beginning. But I do think that the national intelligence process needs to take into account many of the factors that have become increasingly clear in looking at genocides over the past decade. And the work that Human Rights Watch has done is undoubtedly very important in that. Simple things like tracking small arms transfers and illicit transfers, tracking the nature of human rights violations, tracking local radio and media, looking to a larger net of unclassified sources for your information. All of these can help, but more important, I think, is a sensitivity on the part of analysts to what they should be looking for and when they should raise it to the appropriate level. At the same time, I think that the lessons learned process within national governments really needs to occur with a focus on the information and decision process. And I would like to tell you that I know that the United States has done that. I do not believe it has, to the best of my knowledge, notwithstanding the President's acknowledgement that the United States made a huge mistake. And I would hope that one day, national governments that played a leading role in both their acts of omission and commission could come together and talk collectively about what they had learned in looking back over their own records. And finally, you need to begin to develop capabilities. And this is, I mean, in terms of the Genocide Convention, this is pie in the sky. But I'll say it anyway because you have to think big in order to begin with incremental changes. But all of the national troops that engage in peacekeeping training, if the doctrine is revised and if people think more carefully about what it would take to intervene in a genocide, can begin anti-genocide training. And institutions that are in search of a mission, that conduct peacekeeping operations as a means of building camaraderie and interoperability among their members, could begin to train to this. Perhaps a division of labor could be worked out, such as that Dean Nye that described, but one in advance, where the United States would make a commitment that if NATO would provide the initial forces, the United States would commit to transport them to the given spot. And perhaps the United Nations or a regional organization would agree in principle, in the event that genocide had been determined to have occurred by the international community, would agree to then provide the follow-on forces. But these discussions are not even whispers, and I think that if we can't begin to make changes in these three different modes, then we are bound to repeat the mistakes of the past and have only the possibility of an ad hoc coordinated response, which will probably mean no response at all. Thank you.
I'm very honored to be able to speak to you this evening. I recall the remarks which Philip Gravich made about the dreams, the aspirations which the international community had in 1948 when the Genocide Convention was being adopted. But it's intriguing to consider that no less a personality than that of Sir Shawcross, the British prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, had looked upon the Genocide Convention with great skepticism. He considered it a mere delusion to believe that the adoption of the convention would in any appreciable way deter the commission of genocide. Other notable jurists such as Lauterpacht looked at the Genocide Convention as a mere registration of protest against past misdeeds rather than an effective instrument for the repression. Shawcross went so far as to say that genocide could only be punished by war. In retrospect, I think Sir Shawcross was correct. I'm not going to speak so much about what could have been done about the Rwandese genocide. The other panelists have more than capably addressed this question. I'm going to speak rather about how we respond once the genocide has transpired. How do we deal with the trauma of the survivors? How do we deal with the question of national reconciliation? But before addressing that issue, I want to share with you one case which we have investigated before the Rwanda Tribunal, which I think is a very powerful example of how much could have been done with how little in order to save human lives. In the case of Prosecutor versus Rutaganda, Rutaganda was the vice president of the notorious Interahamwe militia. The witness testimony which we gathered indicated that in the days following the mass killings in Rwanda, some 8,500 Tutsi civilians, men, women, and children, congregated at a school outside of Kigali known as the École Technique Officielle, where 15 Belgian UNAMIR soldiers were situated. Several hundred Interahamwe militia under the control of George Anderson Rutaganda did not dare attack a single one of those civilians. Following the killing of the 10 Belgian peacekeepers and the decision of the international community in the infamous Resolution 912 to withdraw UNAMIR's presence with the exception of 200 soldiers, practically every one of those 8,000 Tutsi men, women, and children were slaughtered, with the exception of one or two who somehow survived under the corpses, who were presumed to be dead by the Interahamwe militia, and who now act as our witnesses in this case. Firstly, allow me to say that against this backdrop, the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda can hardly be compared with its historical antecedents at Nuremberg and Tokyo, which were tribunals established when hundreds of thousands of lives were sacrificed in order to fight aggression. Rather, the tribunal can be looked upon more as a fig leaf, as a means to appease the conscience of the international community. For as Philip Gravich explained, we cannot, our conscience cannot remain still in the face of such horrors, even if we do not have the will to act. We at least have to engage in the pretense of useful activity. Having said that, I think it's important to point out that it was the Rwandese government itself which initiated the establishment of the tribunal. Among the reasons why the Rwandese government wished to have such a tribunal is to have an international, impartial, judicial process beyond reproach, beyond any question that it was not an impartial institution, in order to prevent revisionism, in order to prevent those who would characterize what transpired in Rwanda as a civil war, as a spontaneous outburst of tribal hatred, or as a double genocide, to prevent that sort of revisionism, that denial of what transpired. Another more practical reason why the Rwandese government supported the court was because the majority of the perpetrators had fled to third countries, and the prospect of arresting them without a Security Council enforcement mandate obligating all states to surrender these accused would have been extremely difficult. There were fears in the beginning that there would be no diligent prosecution by the tribunal. There were fears that the international community had demonstrated a lack of willingness to confront the génocidaires during the time of the genocide, and that the tribunal likewise would not take decisive action. The tribunal had very difficult beginnings. It is extremely naive in the wake of the Holocaust which transpired in Rwanda, where some 10 to 15% of the population had been exterminated, to imagine that one could instantaneously establish an entire judicial institution with investigatory and prosecutorial apparatus and all of the other complexities which the effective administration of criminal justice requires. Naturally, it took a very long time, and I'm even surprised at how quickly it was possible to initiate prosecutions and this summer to finally get our first convictions. This summer was highly significant. After many problems relating to the establishment of the tribunal, which I will not dwell upon here, the first two convictions were produced by the tribunal. The first was the case of Akayesu, who was the mayor of the Taba commune, who was convicted of genocide and sentenced to life in prison. And the second, much more significant conviction, which was the result of a guilty plea, was that of the former Prime Minister Kambanda, who pled guilty and who was similarly sentenced to life in prison. Very briefly, the question which we all ask is, what is the significance of these prosecutions in the wake of what transpired in Rwanda. It may even be said that it is obscene to reduce the enormity of what transpired in Rwanda to the antiseptic confines of judicial process and legal terminology. I beg to differ. I think that what we are witnessing in the Rwanda tribunal is a very slow, painful, but ultimately indispensable process of healing and reconciliation, without which the future of the Rwandese people will be even more bleak than it may be otherwise. Firstly, we should not discount the importance of providing a means for victims to vindicate their suffering. It is astonishing to see how important it is for victims to come forward and to tell their stories. People whose lives have been destroyed beyond repair. Just to give one example, the women who testified against Akayesu, women who had experienced horrors beyond belief, felt tremendously empowered. They were in awe that they, humble peasants that they were, could contribute to the downfall of someone as powerful as Akayesu, especially in the context of a society where deference to authority was so much a part of their reality. In the case of Kambanda, it is extremely significant that the Prime Minister of Rwanda at the time of the genocide confessed not only to the crime of genocide, but to the crime of conspiracy to commit genocide. Conspiracy which necessarily implicates virtually the entire leadership of the government at the time of genocide. This, I believe, has dealt a severe blow to all those revisionists, and we have already seen many attempts to rewrite the history of what transpired in Rwanda. I believe that it's also important to begin, at least, to eradicate the culture of impunity, which for so long allowed for a repetition of these crimes, because the message has been for so long in the international community that one can commit genocide with impunity. I think it's unrealistic to imagine that the establishment of 2 ad hoc courts for Yugoslavia and Rwanda will instantaneously eradicate that culture, but these are the early beginnings of a process which over time has to transform this culture of impunity. I want to end by referring to what Alison Desforges said about legitimacy in the decision-making process, how even the local actors paid a great deal of heed to legitimacy. The genocide in Rwanda was anything but a spontaneous outburst of tribal hatred. It was a preconceived campaign, a conspiracy to exterminate the Tutsi in Rwanda. For that reason, it is possible to undo some of the damage which has been done by telling the truth, by eradicating the falsehood that enmity between Hutu and Tutsi was inevitable, that it was something which took root in the hearts and minds of people as opposed to the minds of political elites determined to sabotage the Arusha peace process. I just want to end by saying that I'm very impressed by how the victims are infinitely less cynical about the importance of truth than many of the commentators and academics and analysts which I've spoken with. To them, there's no question that without the truth, there will be no future for Rwanda. Thank you.
Ask you all to bear with me here. I have whatever it is that's going around. Nation states risk military force and wage war largely for power and security reasons. It doesn't matter much if those nation states are democratic or authoritarian. This seems to be a truism. And the simplest explanation for this kind of behavior is the environment in which nation states live. As a colleague of mine likes to say, there's no 911 in international politics. If somebody comes after you, your own military power is going to matter a lot to whether or not you come through the trouble successfully. Because military power is expensive and scarce, and because war is risky and costly, states save their military capability for those eventualities that could hurt them. Thus, armed altruism is rare, and when it occurs, it's stingy. Now, a very terrible thing happened in Rwanda, and all of us are interested in trying to find lessons in that terrible thing. And it's so terrible that it's very, very hard to find lessons. One lesson, a lesson that you've heard talked about tonight, is that one of the reasons why this thing could happen was because great and middle powers didn't lift a finger to stop it. And the implication is that all that it would have taken is a finger. Right? The basic argument depends very, very strongly on General Dallaire's claim that 5,000 people could have prevented this horror. Now, it's very, very hard to tell whether 5,000 people could have prevented this horror, right? But it's most unlikely that had American military planners been given the mission the day of our confirmed knowledge that something awful was happening, that they would have decided that 5,000 people, 5,000 soldiers, was enough to send to this place to stop this horror. It's very unlikely that they would have believed anyone who told them that this was so. And my own guess is that their skepticism would have been well-founded. There's no widely accepted method for calculating the number of soldiers that are required for internal police work when there's an insurgency or a civil war. There's no widely accepted measure. But a lot of work has been done in the last few years in trying to figure out how to think about this because these problems come up. And we have to think about this problem against the backdrop of some of the facts that we do know, and that Mr. Gravich's book does a very, very fine job of laying out. This genocide was very well organized in advance on a countrywide basis. While many Hutus probably participated out of a perverse kind of peer pressure, many at the core of the enterprise were very strongly committed to it. When the killing began, it began to a very large extent nationwide, and it was extremely efficient, again, as Mr. Gravich's book suggests. It was also incredibly ferocious, as we know. This was done with, much of this killing was done with edged weapons and with clubs. Now, the motivation required to do this kind of work, as the Hutus dubbed it, is almost impossible for any of us to conceive. And it is, to say the least, strange to suggest that the appearance of 5,000 foreign troops among a population of more than 7 million socially mobilized Hutu could have speedily changed their predisposition to murder. In general, the preferred troop-to-people ratio for internal security operations is around 20 per 1,000. This was the ratio in Northern Ireland, right, during the times that the British faced an insurgency there, to deal with roughly 1,500 hardened killers and terrorists. Only 1,500. The Rwandan regular army was 40 or 50,000 people by the time of this war. The militias may have been another 20,000 by the time of this war. In Somalia, the troop-to-population ratio was somewhere between 5 and 10 per thousand, and this did not work out so well, but suggests a minimum of 40,000 or so troops to police Rwanda. And even for the invasion of Haiti, which came shortly after the Rwandan genocide, the U.S. military planned to put 21,000 troops in the country in under 5 days, 7 battalions of paratroopers and airborne infantry in Port-au-Prince on the first night. And the reason is they believed they had to flood the country with force, to be everywhere, to prevent the heirs of the Tonton Macoute from taking their revenge and killing people. This was their working hypothesis. And Haiti's a very nice comparison, because Haiti's almost the same size as Rwanda. It's almost the same population as Rwanda. And it had at the time a military that we then believed, at least on the basis of bad open source analysis, to be roughly the same size as the Haiti military. But it now turns out that it was vastly larger and vastly better equipped than the Haitian military. This suggests that had Western military planners, professionals, in this situation been asked to plan a mission to go into Rwanda, they would have wanted to take about 25,000 troops at the absolute minimum. At the absolute minimum. Now, how do you get 25,000 troops to Rwanda? The answer is with great difficulty, with very great difficulty. Just to give you an example, the unit that would have been tasked to do this mission from the get-go, the first unit, would probably have been the 82nd Airborne Division. This has a troop strength of about 13,000, which gives you perhaps half the troops you might have thought necessary. This unit, which is very light by the standards of American military units, weighs in at 27,000 tons and requires some 1,300 sorties by large transport aircraft to deliver. And these large transport aircraft require long airfields with high turnaround rates to achieve any speed. There are only 2 or 3 or 4 such airfields, depending on how you count, in the area, and none of them can support very high sortie rates. It would have taken a very long time to get even this small force to the area. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that, right? And that's being relatively generous, relatively liberal. Once they get there, they have to fan out across the countryside to try and stop this killing. Now, we have to remember that there were more than 20,000 dedicated, reasonably well-trained, committed brethren of these Tutsis being murdered in the RPF in the country at the time. These people were presumably fighting as hard as they could, indifferent to casualties, to try and stop this genocide. And nevertheless, it took them several months to finish off the Hutu political and military organization that was engaged in this horror. Now, I think that if you're going to think in the future about doing these kinds of missions, it doesn't do any good to try and find a way to look backward through the Rwandan genocide to show that there is some point and someday where exactly the right troops in exactly the right place could have stopped this thing. Maybe it's true. Right? What's more important to understand is in the future, if you face this kind of situation, they're not going to have all this 20/20 hindsight. They're going to plan on the basis of conservative factors, and they should. One ought not to underestimate third world militaries. One ought not to underestimate military situations where the structure of the situation means you have to be within easy range of a Kalashnikov automatic rifle. Because once you get down to 30 or 40 meters, even a flak vest is probably not going to help you, as several brave Americans discovered in Mogadishu. It's worth noting that this operation is quite daring in its own way, right? There's no handy way to get to this country and establish a landline of communication. There's no ports. It's the middle of nowhere. Several tens of thousands of troops into a very bloody civil war as well as a very bloody genocide at the length of a global tether of airlift. This is a daring operation. Right? It's not as daring as D&B and Foo, right? But it's daring. It's quite daring. It's big. The United States of America only has 10 active divisions. Our third one is already going to Bosnia, and our fourth one is already on alert. Right? We only have 10. Send one or two, 10 to 20% of your land power is already committed to this operation. A lot of expensive airlift goes to it. A lot of money goes to it. You're running the risks of at least a minor military disaster and potentially a major one if somebody guesses wrong. I commend to you a book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which gives a first-person account of the Battle of the Drang in Vietnam. What happens when light infantry in the middle of the nowhere have to face people who turn out to be committed. This doesn't mean that we knew the Hutu were committed. It doesn't mean that they would have been committed. The question is, would it have been professionally responsible to assume that they were not committed and that they were not capable? Would it have been professionally responsible? Would it have been ethical to your own troops, to your own people, to make such an assumption? There's also the risk, as Sarah pointed out, and I think it's important, of doing the wrong thing when you get there. There's a lot you don't know. Modern firepower, when wielded by the Americans, is very, very destructive. In Somalia, we killed many people that we had no intention of killing when we ran into trouble and had to use firepower to solve our problems. Now again, all these are not necessarily reasons to not go, to not do it. They're simply important practical and ethical considerations that will arise in the future if this kind of case emerges. This is the way I think these situations will be evaluated. Now, none of this should be construed as an absolute admonition not to intervene, nor even as a prediction that outsiders never will intervene. I've learned from the hard school not to make too many predictions about international politics or about war. I've been wrong as often as I've been right. I simply wish to leave you with one observation, that this intervention, properly conceived, involved meaningful costs and meaningful risks. States don't usually assume such risks unless their security or their power is somehow affected. In most places where these horrors arise, this will be very difficult to argue. And thus, if you want to be in a position to act, to support the first sentence or the first operative sentence of the Genocide Treaty, if you believe that this is one of America's national missions, then the discussion should be conducted beforehand, and it should be conducted in terms that suggest the intervention will be expensive, will be long-term, will involve American casualties, and then find out if this is what the American people want you to do with their military. Thank you.
I'd like to thank each of our panelists. High quality presentation, very disturbing, disquieting. As was noted earlier by Dean Nye, we do want to give a chance for our distinguished friend and ambassador to the United States from Rwanda to say a few words. Please come forward.
Well, naturally, I should have had more time to comment on issues of Rwanda. But since my colleagues have not been that disciplined to keep in the time frame that has been given to them, I will try to be more gracious. I just say a few things. First of all, probably many of you in the audience have heard about Hutus and Tutsis. Who are these animals? Sometimes I ask myself about this. I ask this because the perception in the international community, whether in the media or in the boardrooms where discussions about international issues take place, there tended to be a perception that the genocide of 1994 was partly the cycle that had repeated itself time and again, an age-old hatred that had existed between these people in Rwanda, and therefore there was nothing spectacular about it. But Hutus and Tutsis indeed speak one language, they share one culture, they have lived on the same hills, they have intermarried, and until the advent of colonization, first by the Germans and then by the Belgians, indeed, if we search the history of Rwanda, we don't see anything in our history that points to that kind of destruction that we witnessed in 1994. So first I wanted to refute that kind of argument that what happened in Rwanda was a culmination of this centuries-old hatred between these people, the Hutus and Tutsis. Second, let me take this opportunity again to say that what happened in Rwanda is not a purely African phenomenon. Again, we see this in the media. I see it in the discussion I hold with many people in the American establishment, in my interaction with people, very senior people, some of them very knowledgeable people, the perception that this is an African phenomenon. Tribes in Africa descending on each other, Africans highly unable to manage their own affairs, and therefore to try and say this is a spontaneous and irrational kind of action on the part of African people. I wish to remind you that the first genocide in this world never took place in Africa. And genocide does not take place necessarily in backward places of the world, because pre-war Europe was indeed an advanced part of the world. It was undergoing industrialization, more advanced than Africa, and yet racism and its effects in terms of the Holocaust are something that are part of the things that you've come to learn about European history. So it's very important to recognize that genocide is not a product of irrational and spontaneous feelings on the part of underdeveloped parts of the world. It's not an African phenomenon. It's something that takes place whenever there are certain defects within society. Third, that you don't have any society where people wake up in the morning and think, oh, why don't we go and carry out genocide? That kind of situation never occurs. For genocide to occur, there must be systemic defects within society that have been going on uncorrected for quite some time. And therefore, genocide of 1994 in Rwanda was the culmination of a long process in which gross violations of human rights had taken place, in which there were defects in governance, in which there was remarkable absence of the rule of law, in which there was a culture of impunity that runs way back from the days of the colonization into the independence days and into the post-independence era. The divisions which the colonizers sowed within our society were simply entrenched at the time of independence, and the elites who took over at the time of independence, rather than challenge that colonial legacy, decided to institutionalize it. So 1994 was the culmination of that process. From 1959, we had this kind of power ideology, this racist ideology. So we had the theory and we had the practice, and the practice was that Rwanda, where it was being celebrated as one of the best performing African countries in terms of what it was doing, was at the same time one country that maintained a huge population of people in diaspora, Rwandese refugees, who were probably the earliest on the African continent. The first ever recorded massacres probably in Africa were from Rwanda. And so it's very important to recognize that these are not simple, spontaneous events, but part of a legacy and deficiencies within society which have not been corrected and end up in this kind of situation. 4, the international community, which we are now saying did not respond, is not, after all, a very disinterested international community. It's not one homogeneous entity. When you talk about the United Nations, primarily, first and foremost, you are talking about the important voices in the United Nations. You are talking about United States, France, you are talking about Russia, you are talking about China, you are talking about Britain. Now, in the case of Rwanda, France was already partisan in the conflict, supporting those who were planning and carrying out genocide. Belgium was the ideological founder of the process of genocide, because I told you during the colonial process, they are the very people who instituted within society the identity cards that clearly stipulated you are Tutsi, you are Hutu, and so on and so forth. And so they are the ideological founders of what went on in Rwanda after independence. And so when it comes to intervene, you can see that, serious as it is, the crime of genocide does not necessarily create a very good attitude in the minds of those who are supposed to intervene. Indeed, France intervened in the form of Operation Turquoise, and we know how the Belgians behaved. So the international community is not always a disinterested international community. 5, I think, and this is the last thing I wanted to mention, that when we say that the international community was inadequate then, it's also important to recognize that it's as inadequate as it was even now. Because what's going on, what has been going on in the region, in the Great Lakes region, and I'm sure many of you read about the Great Lakes region, is that the genocide trend has now become a cross-border or transnational issue, like the issue of drugs, like the issue of terrorism. And the latest victim, of course, is Democratic Republic of Congo. But the same indifference and the same insensitivity that we witnessed in 1994 is what we are witnessing today. There is an outcry about what is going on in Kosovo. There is an outcry that simply demands that the Western powers intervene, and I think they are going to intervene one way or the other. But what kind of outrage do you see with regard to what is happening in the Great Lakes region? I think it's important to recognize this. And so, responding to the remarks made by Mr. Posen, I agree with the part of your analysis, but not entirely. I think it's not enough to say that the international community cannot intervene because it's very difficult, it would take resources, because I think, as Alison has argued, there are other less costly options that the international community could take, which would have tremendous impact. But even these lesser and yet probably cost-effective options, the international community doesn't seem to take them. And it took a few people, Rwandese people, to stop genocide. So if ordinary men and women can stop genocide, I think it's very difficult to imagine why the international community should not make its own contribution in a process like this one. So it's not a question of balancing the airlift capacity, the B-2 bombers, and so on and so forth. I think there's also a question of conviction that this is a global phenomenon which, if not contained, will slowly encroach on the terrain in which humanity lives. And I think it's important to recognize that. And I would wish to conclude by saying that it's not enough simply to study this phenomenon. It's very important, more important, to transform this ugly phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's amazing how these ambassadors have 2 conclusions and 3 conclusions, but very important intervention. I think we need to be reminded that genocide is just a human, all too human affair. We can go back to Thucydides' description of the Athenian killings in Milos, for example, and its history. And we think of course, the Armenians and Jews and others. This is a human affair, but each genocide has its own historical specificity. And that's what we're here tonight to examine. Any questions and queries to each other before we open it up?
Right.
Yes.
I'd just like to comment on Professor Posen's analysis. I have great respect for his capacity as an analyst of military strategy, and I would not in any way wish to question that. But I do have to say, as a person who knows Rwanda extremely well, that his data on Rwanda is not accurate, and so I feel his conclusions are not accurate either.
I would just
What
like
was
to
it-
say
what was it that was
May I?
inaccurate? What was it that was inaccurate, Alice?
Well, the statistics, for example, on the number of militia active at the start of the genocide are not accurate by a factor of about 10. The statement that the violence was nationwide is inaccurate. It was spotty, sporadic for at least the first 8 or 10 days. The statement that there were large numbers of absolutely committed people involved in the genocide from the start, that is not accurate. It was not organized in advance in the sense that everyone was ready to go throughout the country. It had been discussed in the circles of a very small and limited number of leaders who had a sketchy plan outlined. It was in no way implemented nationwide until considerably into the genocide. It was a cobbled together response that happened rather rapidly because there were a number of committed people ready to act, but it was not the case that you had 7 million people up in arms from the day one. In fact, you never had 7 million people up in arms. You probably had no more than 100,000 who were equipped to kill at the very end in a very wide variety of situations. The military experts who were on the ground at the time, and this was not just General Dallaire, but Colonel Marchal, who was the commander of the Belgian force, the French commander Langsade, and who was not on the ground, fortunately, but who did have wide acquaintance with the military situation, and the RPF, all estimated troops essential in the range, beginning with the RPF of 900 through Dallaire's 5,000, passing by 2,500, Lansade's estimate and Marchal's estimate. So we are a long way from 25,000 troops being required. The important point here is that this was a highly centralized system which was unstable and which could have been stopped by a relatively small demonstration of force in the early days. The extent of centralization was such that had the small circle of leaders been stopped in the capital, this would have immediately caused the end of violence throughout the rest of the country.
I'd like to just say, I didn't, to the extent that the idea that it started immediately all over the country at once was something that my books, that Mr. Posen said that my book suggested. I didn't mean to suggest that. On the other hand, I would say that when one says it took a long time to get going, we're talking about 9 days between April 6th and April 15th.
Yeah, but the evacuation force was there on Saturday morning at 3 a.m.
Sure, but the point is that, in other words, to formulate plans that weren't formulated at that point. Once the killing began, the speed with which these things take place, I am willing to concede that we don't have a clear answer as to what the military strategy required to have, for instance, confronted this small group would have been. I also just want to say, we haven't really talked about, in talking about what the international community, what should we have done, the implication is that this is somehow for us to do or fail to do exclusively, and we haven't actually really mentioned concretely, even the ambassador only alluded to the fact, how this genocide was effectively brought to a halt, which was according to Shawcross's prosecutor Shawcross's formula, by war. And that war was waged exclusively by the rebel movement, for which the ambassador at the time was an ambassador, called the Rwandese Patriotic Front. And basically, had Rwandans not fought to bring this to an end, nobody was fighting to bring it to an end at that point. The other thing I'd like to point out is the argument made both in Alison Desforges' presentation and in Pyme's presentation that international legitimacy is, in a sense, the key here, that people were waiting to participate in the genocide to see if that was legitimate or illegitimate. It seems to me to not hold up entirely, at least in the current situation, where plenty of people are participating in genocide, even as the International Tribunal is established to show that it is illegitimate, even as the current government, even to the chagrin of many human rights activists around the world, enjoys a certain amount of international legitimacy, even as, presumably, it is a criminalized thing, according to all sorts of treaties and utterances, to be a part of this genocidal movement. On the contrary, this movement seems to thrive as a kind of oppositionist, rump, roving terrorist organization that benefits endlessly from UN hospitality and refugee camps now in the Central African Republic and Congo-Brazzaville. These sorts of patterns have never ended, and they don't need legitimacy. That doesn't seem to be something they care about, nor have the UN convictions in any way stopped the movement of the genocidaire. You haven't seen a sort of sudden mass capitulation of leaders looking for places to surrender. You haven't suddenly had people saying, okay, we'll stop killing inside Rwanda. Nor is the International Tribunal, for that matter, required to help victims testify. They're quite capable of doing so in Rwanda. We don't need to hold their hands to provide that service. And so I think that in talking about what might we have done, we also might talk about what did happen, how Rwanda has, once left alone to deal with this, dealt with it for better and quite often for worse, with what we have done for better and for worse.
Yeah, it sounds like we've got disagreement both about some facts and most significantly what the weight of those facts are and what implications they have. I want to give Professor Posen a chance to say a word in reply if he would like, and then we'll open up for questions.
Well, I'd just like to point out that there's actually several things we seem to agree on, although I'm not sure that we actually do, right? One of them is that this genocide was well organized in advance, that there was a network throughout the society of people who had talked about, planned for, acquired weapons for, right, for large-scale killing. I think that's now considered to be a fact about Rwanda, right? So I think that's a fact that we share, right? The second thing I think we share is that something like 800,000 people were killed, right? And they were killed in a particularly brutal way over a very short period of time, which at least suggests after the fact that there was a considerable amount of energy and support for it. It's very difficult to square 800,000 dead with all of these people who were just waiting around for some order or suggestion that they ought not to do it. This isn't a country where this has happened before. It's not credible. Now, the place where I think there is a dispute, and where I have seen other people, right, including students of mine, who've gone over the maps of the killings, the reports of the killings, day by day and place by place, and they find that much of the killing began very, very quickly. You think 8 days, you think 9 days, you think that perhaps there was more killing in Kigali to start with, and if the right thing or the right people had been stopped in Kigali, that somehow this thing could have been stopped. Maybe so. Maybe so. But I don't find it very plausible, given the facts that we have in common.
We open it up yet to the audience. Questions, queries, and we can weave in some of the
I'd like to
responses.
my name is Randall. I covered Turquoise. Just for Professor Posen's information, the only people who did go in and stop anything were the French. I'm not going to go into the reasons why, but the French did save 8,000 Tutsis. They didn't use 13,000 men. They used about 1,500.
The third person behind you can say more about it than I can.
Sorry?
I can talk to you later.
Okay. But what I'm saying is, if the French, for whatever the reasons, with 1,500 people could save 8,000 people as late as July, what the devil, when I listen to you, I hear every American general I've ever known over 40 years as a correspondent making excuses for not doing anything. I don't care that much about Rwanda, although it was one of the not the pleasantest stories I covered in a career. But what I do know is, between Mrs. Sewell and yourself, all I've heard is a lot of gobbledygook. We have the most expensive military in the world. We're spending a fortune for it, and it's an enormous army. And you're telling me we can't spare the 82nd Airborne? Fine.
I didn't tell I'm going to assume that didn't actually want an answer.
To the left, yes, right ahead.
The Rwandese genocide was a tragedy, and a tragedy in which there was no winner except death. When we speak about this tragedy, I usually get confused, particularly when it is in an academic forum like this, that we usually focus on effects and forget to give some attention to the causes. The question was, what should have been done? And probably we could also add, what should be done? Because the situation is not, normal yet. It still continues. And because of that, I think it is appropriate to take a look at the causes of these problems, in which, since much of what has been said, come back home to the USA. Now, the move that led to the genocide started in a congressional hearing in 1984. I attended it, and it started by way of working for the welfare and the betterment of the refugees, particularly the Rwandese refugees. Now, the U.S. Senate Committee on Refugees took it up, and it was put in the hands of Mr. Roger Winter. But unfortunately, instead of guiding what was being done towards finding a solution, the RPF was encouraged to exist, and the result of that was, first, the training of a future leader of the invasion of Rwanda from Uganda, who trained here in the United States in Kansas, and the invasion was initiated. It continued with all its pits and pitfalls, and nothing was done from the United States by way of trying to look seriously into this and stop what was going on. The whole thing was catapulted by the invasion of Rwanda, until when it culminated into the sad events of 1994.
Now, did you have a question, though, because I
no, I'm making a suggestion. I'm making a suggestion. We said, unless we the truth has come out, we shall continue going in circles. And if we may try to avoid going in circles, then we have to go to the truth and bring out all these points that led to this problem. Yeah,
Any responses to those important comments there?
I think the question of the U.S. involvement is an important one, but one which is often misread, certainly from the perspective of a human rights organization that attempted to enlist the assistance of the U.S. government in protecting Tutsi within Rwanda. I would say that the policy was very solidly up through April 6, 1994, more or less opposed to the RPF and not at all concerned with protecting the lives of Tutsi. So I understand where the gentleman is coming from in terms of the association between Uganda and the United States and the military training and so on and so forth. But having lived this on the ground and having tried very hard to bring the U.S. government to a position of greater involvement in protecting Tutsi inside Rwanda, I didn't see that. That was not the perspective that I saw.
I might add that if I understand correctly, there's the suggestion afoot that in some ways, which is a widespread suggestion, that in some ways the RPF's engagement in war led to the genocide against Tutsis. And whatever may be said about the destabilization of the Rwandan political environment caused by the RPF, and even about the RPF's indifference or concern about that, the only way that one can accept the equation that the RPF led to the genocide is to make an argument essentially on the basis of short skirts invite rape, which is that genocide is a provocable crime, and that those who are killed are in some ways killed because of a provocation by an active political party. If it's the RPF you want to fight, fight the RPF. If it's a genocide you want to have a genocide, but don't confuse the two. And I think it's very important to keep those things straight.
Question?
I would like to start by a small testimony before I ask the question.
Small, incisive, but brief, right?
Yes. Yeah, when I went to cover the genocide in Rwanda from Burundi, I saw in many borders, borders from Burundi and Rwanda, Tanzania and Rwanda, and Congo, Zaire and Rwanda, many bodies, thousands of bodies of people killed, Tutsis. So my question here is this. When we are talking about international community, and I just hear the ambassador, he said, very good speech in which I share many things. And I would like to, he did the same mistake. Because when we talk about international community, we think about only France, Europe, or America. We never thought about African countries. Those people who died in the 5 kilometers from those borders, they will be saved by the militaries in those countries. So let's when we are talking about the question of genocide, we have to involve also many countries and make them responsible on some questions of that. So please stop, try to make it larger and don't talk about white countries in stopping genocide. Thank you.
Let's go right to the next one.
I speak as an African, and I couldn't agree with my brother more, because the easy way out, in the days of the Cold War, it was relatively easy to play one superpower against the other. And I believe that many African leaders are really longing for those Cold War days when they used to be able to play the United States against the Soviet Union. And many of them are complaining bitterly now that this unipolar world is not really good and it's not to their best interest. But having said that, I think I ought to ask the panelists the question. When But before I do that, I think I also want to call the attention to the fact that in Sudan, a war has been raging for, God knows, 2 decades or so. Africans wiping out Africans. Liberia had just ended over a war that lasted over 7 years or so. Chaos in Sierra Leone, and practically everywhere you look in Africa, you find one disaster giving way to one calamity. I believe that ultimately Africans are going to have to save themselves. But back to the point I was going to make.
Well, that question you
Yeah,
had
the
in
question
mind.
is,
Yeah,
yes,
that's the one.
succinct and to the point. The lady, Ms. Sewell, if Rwanda had been Iraq, with the United States and the international community responded much more with a greater degree of alacrity than has been the case.
No, it's a good question. Who was that?
Can I ask you a follow-up, sir? If a genocide were committed in Iraq, genocide you're talking about, not an invasion of a neighboring state in Rwanda.
If Rwanda had the amount of oil that Iraq had.
But her question is a good answer, because when the Iraqis are after the Kurds, we're not that interested.
If I could comment on the African involvement, Nigeria at the start played a very positive role in preventing the complete and total withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping force from Rwanda at a time when the United States was bent on doing that. Later on, however, Nigeria and Djibouti refused the use of the word genocide in a UN Security Council resolution because they didn't want to embarrass their fellow African. When the time came to mount a second UN peacekeeping force, it was extremely difficult to find an African nation that would contribute troops. And when they did agree to contribute troops, most of them found it desirable to delay the departure of the troops in order to extort, well, extort is probably a good word, extort the maximum amount of equipment possible from the nations that were paying the bill. Now, this is a standard UN procedure that everyone acknowledges happens, and there was nothing unusual about it except for the fact that it was taking place in the context of a genocide, so you would have thought they could have dispensed with it for once, right?
Next question.
The gentleman who asked the first question over here has left, but I would like to comment on what he said anyway about the French going into Rwanda. It's a brief comment and then a question. I think that they actually saved about 20,000 people, which is more than he said, and the vast majority were saved in a single death camp that they took over almost as soon as they entered the country, and that's why a small force could save so many people. In fact, in the safe zone that they set up, the killing continued long after the French were there because the French didn't have enough people to police the safe zone. And I guess I will get a comment on that. My question, again, concerns numbers. And I think it's important to focus on these because it cuts to the heart of whether anything military could have been done in response to the genocide. I appreciate the fact that people have said there are many other things that could have been done, and we haven't talked about those very much. But on the military front, it's critical to understand exactly when the genocide started in different parts of the country. And I'm one of those people who believes that it started everywhere almost right away. And I base my judgment on two main sources. One is transcripts of the rebel radio station and what they thought was going on, which are translated in Phoebus. This is Radio Mutabura, which is the Tutsi rebel radio station. The other source is African Rights put out a book, and I would like to get both Mr. Gravich's and Ms. DeForge's opinion of that book and how good the data is in it. They say that everything started, that the genocide blew up all over the place almost right away.
I don't believe even they do. I mean, I think that it's clear, it's an established fact that, for instance, in Butare, which is sort of the exemplary instance,
Well, it's exemplary, that's the point.
yeah, it's the exemplary instance of the fact that until it was brought to Butare, Butare did not fall to the genocide, that Butare was something of a safe haven. It had a disobedient governor, shall we say, or independent-minded governor. His removal was required, and orders had to be given after 2 weeks. We're not talking about a terribly long period of time, but long enough for it to become clear that the sort of implementation of this thing was not just all at once, all everywhere. I think that just in terms of that, and I don't think African Rights would present the thing any differently, I think that in their accounting of the story, that at least is the basic fact. And so I think...
I'll just make one quick comment on that. Butare was the only prefecture with a Tutsi governor. And
yeah,
so
but
it's
I
not
mean,
surprising that
fine.
it didn't happen
Gitarama
in
was
Butare, but the
also
rest of-
slow to go fully. Various places required a certain amount more cajoling or less cajoling. This thing did not happen in all places at once. It's just clear. It's clear that there are places where it happened more intensively in the first week, other places where it happened more intensively in the second week, other places, etc. So I think that question, if that seems to be a question that's of great concern to strategists, I think that it's sort of hard for, what I don't understand is, it didn't happen everywhere at once, tells us a lot about how it spread. Does it tell us anything of military significance, since it happened very damn quickly? It did spread very damn quickly. I mean, we're talking about a week or two, and is that significant in the kind of strategic planning and strategic decision-making that we're discussing? Perhaps it's not. Perhaps that's tantamount to all at once. But in terms of the internal mechanisms of it, and in terms of understanding how it operated in Rwanda, it's crucial that it didn't happen everywhere at once.
Mr. Ford,
On the
quick comment and question.
question of the French, one reason that the killing went on in the French zone had absolutely nothing to do with the number of French troops. It had to do with French policy, you see? There was a big difference there because the troops were not ordered to stop the killing. Therefore, the killing went on. And that is very fully documented. You can read all about it. Particularly at the incident in Bisesero, where the French Minister of Defense was present on the scene and informed that there were Tutsi being slaughtered at that very moment, 4 kilometers down the road, and he was asked by Commander Marin Gillier what to do about it. And Léotard's answer was, we can't take care of everything at once, you have your orders. And what they were taking care of at that point was providing high-protein biscuits to the Interahamwe. So there's good reason why some of the killing went on in the French zone. Now, admittedly, once they did decide to stop it, it did not stop instantaneously, but they were perfectly able to control it within a relatively short span of time, once they got their act together and decided that, for whatever reason they made the decision, that this was something that they then had to do. On the question of how rapidly the genocide took place, the large-scale massacres began on the 13th of April. Before the 13th of April, people were driven from their houses. There was killing in the streets and at the blockades, but except for a few relatively small scale, what are we talking about small scale? Hundreds of people, not tens of thousands, in churches. Large-scale killing began on the 13th of April. The European forces had their evacuation forces, top-rate elite units, fully equipped, landing in Rwanda on day 3 at 3 a.m. April 13th was, 6 or 7 days after that. Okay, so they were there in force and they left. There were 360 American Marines on day 3 of the genocide in Bujumbura, which was 20 minutes away by airplane. And there were many more American Marines just immediately off the coast of East Africa on a large aircraft carrier. There were Italians who landed in Kigali in that same period. I think there were 180 of them. There were 2,700 UNAMIR troops present in the country, admittedly of variable quality. But there were a lot of troops there, and there were a lot of troops there that could have been there, landed very rapidly. Now, the question of how fast the killing spread in Gikongoro prefecture, there were 3 main centers almost immediately, but the rest of the prefecture remained calm until the 19th of April. Butare prefecture, there was killing in Yakizu beginning on the 15th of April, but the rest of the prefecture was calm until the 21st of April. Gitarama prefecture was a little bit spotty, but basically held against the genocide until the 18th of April. So no, it was not instantaneous throughout the country. In addition, if you look at the distribution of Tutsi, there were very few Tutsi in the whole northern third of the country. Why? Because, first of all, the RPF controlled the area to the east, and to the west, that was a region which had been effectively cleansed, quote unquote, of Tutsi long before. There were hundreds at most left in the prefecture of Ruingeri. So you didn't even have to think about large-scale action there. And in Gisenyi, they were limited geographically into a relatively small area, and they were not very numerous either. So the number of prefectures you're looking at is altogether on the order of, let's see, there were 11 altogether. You deduct 3, that leaves you 8, and there were at least 3 where the genocide was slow to get started, so that leaves you 3 from 8. That leaves you maybe 5 out of 11 prefectures where things began relatively rapidly, and that was essentially Kigali City, Kigali Rural, Kibungo Prefecture to the east, and Kibuye to the west, and Cyangugu to the southwest.
Thank you very
Sorry,
much.
without a map, it doesn't make much sense.
That's an answer, though. We're running out of time, you all. Maybe one last question. You all ready for one last question before we go? Go right ahead, and
Okay,
we'll bring it to a close.
Philip Verwimp, Belgian citizen and currently at Yale University. I have a comment and a question, but I'll...
No, just a question, though, brother.
Just a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Not a comment, right? Okay.
Not even page 3 of the comment.
All right. Just a question then, which is more important. In Belgium, we have actually a revisionist debate going on, saying that a second genocide happened, committed by the RPF. And I would like to ask the panel, what is the evidence of human rights abuses and gross human rights violations on the RPF before, during, and after the genocide? That's my question.
Any panelists?
I'm ready to go. Anyone else?
I'm ready to go too, so why don't you go ahead?
Please.
I think that there's no question that there are human rights abuses committed by the RPF before, during, and after the genocide. I think that the question of whether that constitutes a dual genocide, in other words, if the sum of these abuses constitutes anything comparable to the genocide, is a different question, a distinct question, a question that matters and does not nullify the abuses that have been committed, but it also shouldn't mean that all abuses somehow sum out in exactly the same way. And I think that there's a tremendous attraction to outside observers in generally thinking a pox on both their houses, they're all equally bad, they're all in the stew, because it sort of exempts us from any other kind of judgments, assessments, and elsewhere. And we can basically say, well, then they just kill each other. And it also exempts us from any kind of meaningful leverage against abuses, any kind of meaningful criticism, or any kind of meaningful discussion of what might be done within the grayer area between total exterminatory, genocidal abuse and more piecemeal, hard to identify what is systematic, what is lack of control, and what is exertion of control by the government, et cetera, which I think is much more the pattern with the abuses since.
Last comments? I think,
Yes, I would like to return to the question of the tribal war thesis, if you like, of genocidal violence. I have here a quote from a study performed by 2 Canadian sociologists and historian, Frank Chalk and Kurt Jonassen, an excellent book called The History and Sociology of Genocide, where they examine genocides from antiquity until the modern age. They come to the following conclusion. In order to perform a genocide, the perpetrator has always had to first organize a campaign that redefined the victim group as worthless, outside the web of mutual obligations, a threat to the people, immoral sinners, and/or subhuman. Even after such a campaign of vilification and dehumanization, the actual performance of the mass killing seems to have required a good deal of coercion and centralized control. It seems that mass killing is extremely difficult for ordinary people to carry out. It requires the recruitment of pathological individuals and criminals. Now, I'm neither a historian nor a sociologist. What I know in the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Rwanda, and in former incarnations in Nagorno-Karabakh is that incitement, the use of the media, the use of the state's resources and apparatus is absolutely indispensable to perform large-scale violence. One of my friends in Sarajevo once said, imagine if in a time of economic decline and confusion in America, the Ku Klux Klan came to power and controlled all media. And for 4 years, indoctrinated, misinformed, and incited the population. I can assure you that the picture would be very ugly, no less ugly than what we've seen in other parts of the world. I really think that we have to think long and hard about the fallacy of what is called the tribal war thesis, which is being pushed forward as realism. I think it's simply cynicism. I want to simply make two other quick points.
Two points, huh?
Very short points.
Well, we're really running out. Just one last quick point, and then we'll have Allison. Because
the idea that it would require an absolute minimum of 25,000 soldiers in Rwanda. I do not claim to be a military expert, but let's remember that it took 30,000 S4 troops combined with NATO bombardments to control the infinitely more difficult situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where you had real armies with real artillery, real weapons.
Completely wrong. You're right. You're not a military expert.
The other
Professor Posen, did you want to make some comments?
If I may just add one last point, that the Canadian government and the Dutch governments have both recommended now for several years the establishment of a rapid deployment force composed entirely of volunteers, so we don't have to worry about members of our toy armies being killed. Why is there no interest at all in even allowing people who voluntarily want to go and intervene in such situations? Why do we not allow the establishment of such institutions?
I can answer that question. Right?
Go right ahead.
The reason we don't allow the establishment of those institutions is because when those institutions get themselves into trouble, the fingers are going to be pointed at us to pull them out of trouble. That's why we don't.
But it won't make a difference anyway.
That's why we don't.
So.
Please, one more question.
Oh,
please.
Okay,
really quick.
Before that, I want to claim the right to make one response, because I had asked to respond previously to the question about RPF abuses. Rather than Philip's comment of a pox on both your houses, my point of view is a justice on both your houses, and there were RPF abuses, and they must be prosecuted.
Really concise.
We've got to come to a close. We've got a voice here and a voice here.
Mics in the
Yeah, hitting mic. I didn't realize.
Is it who
they had
speaks
mics
louder?
up. Luke?
I can't see because
Well,
the
let's
light.
do this, though. If you take 30 seconds and you take 15, then we'll bring this to a close. We've got to bring this to a close.
Sure. Actually, my question is for you, Professor West. What?
There's a mistake. During your time in Rwanda.
Mistake.
What happened to our sense of moral outrage? What Ms. Sewell was saying was that the finger was being pointed from Kofi Annan to the international community, to the U.S., to the Congress, and then ultimately, possibly to the people. Maybe not. But what happened to our sense of moral outrage? We saw those bodies, those cadavers, going down rivers on the cover of the New York Times extensively for that month of April. What happened to our sense, and what's happening now to it? What's happening in Kosovo? Is this persistent in our culture and in the culture of the West?
Good question. Well, the answer is, I think, that when you say R, you could say R as an American, R as a human being, R as black, brown, red, or what have you. I think foreign policy is always a question of political will as well as capability. And so I think the moral outrage was felt, and you can see it in various newspapers, be it in the mainstream press with various voices, sometimes too isolated. I certainly saw it in the black press, but not enough. I certainly didn't see it enough of black leadership, but there was some, Randall Robinsons and others. But one wondered whether the country had the political will to follow through on a form of bringing power and pressure to bear such that you would have an impact. And so, as is often the case in the United States, when it comes to foreign policy, you get the sense that you're upset, but wondering whether your voice will really be heard when it comes to the fundamental decisions that are made. And that raises larger questions of how political will relates to foreign policy, as well as the technical capacity and so forth. And that's a deep political and ideological question, which is not in any way an excuse. We need more strong voices to articulate this moral outrage. But it also has to do with the distance that so many fellow American citizens feel between themselves and how foreign policy actually is enacted in our society. 15 seconds.
Okay. My question is, what are repercussions or consequences for accomplice countries in a genocide like France, which trained and financed and protected the leader of the genocide in a so-called safe zone, and still now protect some of the leaders of the genocide? Is this an international tribunal case? Is this, what kind of case is this? And also, I'm thinking about the cases of embargoes in Libya and bombing in Sudan. What do we do for countries like that?
Appreciate the question.
It's a good question. The question is essentially, is there any consequence for failure to act? It's striking that one of the things that the new Rwandan government has always been eager to take people, bring people to fault for in its courts is failure to act to protect citizens in danger. This is not something that there are consequences for the failure to act in the international community. On the contrary, we see Kofi Annan, people got promoted. Madeleine Albright became Secretary of State. Kofi Annan became Secretary General. It wasn't such a bad thing to mess up in Rwanda. It was just a career step. And if you look at it that way, there are no consequences. There is nothing that sticks. We don't care. And I think that that's one of the crucial questions. Obviously, we would find it somewhat bizarre if all of a sudden Madeleine Albright were hauled before the International Criminal Tribunal as if she were in some way responsible for something comparable to the man who organized the Interahamwe massacres. But I think that we do have to wonder, is there any way to hold, this raises a larger question, is there any way to hold foreign policy to account? And ultimately, presumably, it would be the ballot box. And that does then raise the question that I think is crucial in all of this, which is, it's easy to ignore things we don't know about. I'm a reporter. I find that, in fact, Rwanda is rather conveniently easy to ignore a good deal of the time, and many places are, because they don't appear in the paper. There is no sort of overall drumbeat in which these events, not only is it that people get promoted because there is nothing sticks, we don't stick it to them. And it's essentially the court of public opinion, which we are left with, that becomes essentially the democratic court of public opinion in responding to foreign policy failures.
Excuse me, Philip, if I could add just a corrective to that. In Belgian court, 2 ministers have been sued for failure to come to the assistance of people